Hi, welcome to our video lecture on Ice Age migrations. And wow, what a fascinating topic, at least for me, trying to picture what it must have been like for people living all those thousands of years ago. And that's where I want to start by talking about time. Time, and especially long periods of time, is something that's really hard to picture and to understand for a human being because we're only here alive on the earth for such a short period of time. If we're lucky, maybe 80 years or so. But the earth has been around so much longer than that, and we have just this tiny, tiny perspective on things. So let me broaden your perspective and give you a better understanding of time as it relates to the earth itself. And we're going to do this visually with what I call time by the dots. So I have a page of dots here, and we're going to pretend that each dot represents 1,000 years. And if each dot on this page represents 1,000 years, then what you're looking at is about 3 million years of history, which is actually not very long when you consider the age of the Earth. So let's take those pages of dots and multiply them. Now we've got 35 pages of those dots, and yet we still only have about 105 million years of time on this page. It would actually take 10 pages like this to make up 1 billion years. But the Earth has been around for over 4 billion years. So you'd have to have 40 pages like this, which is 35 pages of this. You can multiply out how many pages of this shot would equal the age of the Earth. But let's just stick with a lot, right? It's almost mind-boggling how long the Earth has been around. Now, what I did on this page is I highlighted at the top a few rows of dots. That represents the time that humans have been alive on this earth. We've only been alive this much time. And yet it would take 40 pages of dots like this to represent the age of the earth. So we've really only been here for just almost like a moment in time. Human beings have been around for maybe a couple 100,000 years, 200,000 or 300,000 years. But the Earth has been around for 4.5 billion. So now let's zoom back into just one page of dots. And what you see highlighted in purple is the length of the last ice age. And the last ice age ended, 12,000 years ago or so. And that's what you see in yellow. So what you see in yellow is the length of time since the last ice age. So the time period that this reading, Ice Age Migrations, is discussing is this time period here in purple. All right. And for much of this time period, human beings were not around. Human beings appeared, about the first 3 rows of dots here is how long humans have been around. So for much of our history, the Earth was an ice age. All right. It's only the last 12,000 years of human history where we've enjoyed the warm weather. Okay, so let's talk about some of the information that you read about. Glaciers, these huge sheets of ice that formed across the Earth's surface, had an enormous impact during the Ice Age. And you're going to be watching a video that will demonstrate some of, where I'll discuss some of the weather patterns and how the weather patterns affected the climate and the ocean levels during the last Ice Age. But for now, let's just stick with this idea that it got really cold. And when it got really cold, the water that fell from the sky as rain or snow, it just stuck on the surface and it became glaciers, these huge sheets of ice, which over time grew into glaciers over a mile thick, which is, when I read that information in the reading, that some of these glaciers during the Ice Age were actually 2 miles thick, I couldn't believe that until I went back and looked at this and realized that when you're talking about 3 million years of history, each dot is 1,000 years. Well, that was a lot of time for that water to freeze and the water and the ice to build up. And essentially these glaciers, really think of them as like rivers of ice, because during an ice age there are short periods of warmth where the glacier will melt just a little bit and then it will slide forward. But the next winter it freezes and more ice is added to the glacier. So glaciers were really moving things. They moved incredibly slow, just a few inches a year. But as they moved across the Earth's surface, they crushed everything that was beneath it. And most of the northern part of North America was covered by these huge sheets of ice during the last ice age, including New York State. So just how cold do you think it got during the last ice age? Let's take a minute to think about that question and try to come up with an answer, which is probably going to be a guess on your part. I also have a very humorous cartoon on the screen about freezing your butt off. Well, just how cold was it during the last ice age? Let's try to fill the blank in here and figure it out. So you might be surprised to know that the answer is only 12 degrees. On average, the temperature on the Earth was about 12 degrees colder at any point in the year. So think of it like this. If it was normally, we had a very hot summer this year, 90 degrees. We hit 90 degrees several days. Well, what if the hottest days this summer were only 78? Or in the wintertime, it gets, when it's like 25 degrees out, you're like, whoa, that's cold. Well, what if all those days it was only 12? And 12 degrees may not seem like a lot, but it did have a huge impact on the environment and the climate, leading to the formation of these huge glaciers, which only made the Earth colder because, of course, it's like living on top of an ice cube. So one effect that the glaciers had on geography was it was the glaciers that dug out the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are really just big holes left in the ground by the glaciers. And then when the glaciers melted, the water from the glacier filled in the lakes. And the Finger Lakes were also part of this process and were formed, or at least became much larger during the last ice age. And here's another photograph, one of my favorite pics of the Great Lakes from outer space at night. You can see all the lights are the cities. So this would be Rochester. This would be Buffalo. Up here is Toronto, because of course this is Lake Ontario. And then this, it looks like clouds to me. So the clouds are sort of obscuring. New York City would be down here. But of course, almost all of Long Island is lit up because that's a very heavily populated area. But another effect of the Ice Age was the land bridge that formed up in the northern part of North America. And your reading talked quite a bit about that, and you're going to see a demonstration on that. The main outcome here, the main result, is that this possibly allowed the first humans to cross over into North America from Asia. And where they crossed became known as the Bering Strait Land Bridge, sometimes referred to as Beringia. It might have looked like this, at least in the summertime. And it was populated by giant animals. In fact, that's one of the weird things about the last ice age is North America and Asia were filled with what scientists call megafauna, these huge animals. We're used to, for example, three-toed sloths, if you've ever seen a sloth, right? Well, the sloths during the Ice Age were like 20 feet long. And then you had huge cave bears, and my favorite, I think, is the saber-toothed tiger. But one in particular that people think is really cool is the woolly mammoth, the mastodons, which are now extinct, but they were alive during the last Ice Age. And they were often hunted by Native Americans, or sometimes we called these people back then Paleo Indians because they lived during the Stone Age. Paleo means stone. So these Paleo Indians often hunted the woolly mammoths. I mean, how did they do that? You look at the size of a woolly mammoth compared to a person, but they were able to, and we have some proof of that, actually. So I did assign you guys a journal assignment, a mystery pick. And maybe we can just take a minute and look at the pic again and think about, what is this? What is this picture showing us, and how does it connect to the reading? Well, here is your answer. That picture was showing you a hut, a home built out of woolly mammoth bones that was being excavated by archaeologists who were studying those artifacts. Remember, artifacts are objects left behind by humans in the past. Now, a bone is not really an artifact unless a human being used that bone for something. And in this case, human beings were using bones to actually create homes. Pretty cool, huh? And you can see some of the techniques the archaeologists are using here. They're numbering everything because when they pull this apart and take it back to the museum or wherever they're going to do their work on it, they want to be able to recreate it and put each bone back in the exact spot where they found it. And then by piecing it together, they can better understand these cultures in the past and how people adapted to their environment. And in fact, that's a really important word for this unit, adapt. So this word is in your unit packet. It means to adjust to a new situation, to solve a problem, or take advantage of an opportunity in the environment. Let's just focus on the first part of that definition, to adjust to a new situation, or to adjust to any situation, really. And if you look at this picture, how has this child adjusted to the situation of cold weather? Let's think about that. Okay, so what we've got here is a child who has warm clothing. His parents probably have given him a warm hat and a warm coat. So now that the weather has turned, his clothing is going to be different. He has now adapted to this new situation of the cold weather with warmer clothes. Here's another child who's done the same thing. This is a Native American child, a modern-day Inuit Indian, who is dressed in a sealskin and fur coat. So the difference here is that this child, their parents probably went to Walmart and just bought him the clothes. But in this case, this child's parents have actually taken a natural resource and used it to sew a coat, which probably is warmer than any coat that you and I have ever put on. So this leads us to a new definition that I'm going to have you add to your packet. I think this definition is a little better for our unit. And this definition of adapt is to use a natural resource to meet a basic need, whether it's food, shelter, or clothing. So let's pause here and add that to your unit packet right above or right next to the word adapt. Now let's take a minute to think about how you and your family might adapt to the cold weather and the snowy conditions. Of course, there's a lot of ways to do this, especially here in Rochester where the weathers can be pretty cold. It might involve snow plows, snow blowers, snow shovels. Those are all ways of adapting to the environment. And, for some people, it's as simple as turning up the thermostat in their house so that furnace will turn on and keep them warm. In my case, I live out in the country, so my furnace runs on propane, and propane is pretty expensive. So a lot of people out in the country actually still heat their homes with wood stoves, as I do. So I have a wood-burning stove in my house. It keeps my whole house nice and warm all winter long. And I end up spending a lot of the summertime cutting down and chopping firewood and stacking firewood to get ready for the winter. So that's one way that my family adapts to the cold weather. Native Americans also adapted to the cold weather with certain types of shelters called igloos. Now, these are Native Americans of the North called the Inuit, and they have taken a natural resource, snow, and used it to build a home, an igloo. Here's an igloo with Blaine. I don't even know if that thing is real. That's like the coolest igloo I have ever seen. Let's look at one more example, a modern day example of human beings adapting to a harsh desert environment. Take a look at this picture and see if you can figure out what it is. This is a satellite photograph from way up in space of farms. These are farms in the desert, and the way that they're able to farm in the desert is they're pumping water to the surface to irrigate their crops. And the water is coming from these natural aquifers located hundreds of feet underground. Now, I think that this picture is taken somewhere in the Middle East. This may be somewhere over in the Arabian Desert. But it is a great example of human beings using modern day technology to adapt to a harsh desert environment. A very important concept for this unit is that Native Americans' culture changed depending on where they lived and what their environment was like. So the first thing to understand is that when the Ice Age ended, after these Native Americans had crossed into North America from Asia, the weather warmed up, and over time, North America's environment changed. It changed depending on where you live. So it wasn't just cold everywhere. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. It wasn't just like ice and snow everywhere. It really depended on your location. And your location back then, similar to today, was going to determine what the environment was like. So today, if you live in New York State, you're never going to see a cactus, right? And you're going to have cold winters, warm summers. If you're down in Arizona, you're going to have winters where it really doesn't snow. The temperature drops a little bit, but you're going to have extremely hot summers, and there's going to be a lot of desert, a lot of dry conditions. And that's going to be different from, say, the Northwest coast, where they have mild winters, even though they're located at the same latitude or even a little further north than us here in Rochester. But because they're so close to the ocean, they get a lot of rain, but not a lot of snow. And then you have the Arctic, which, of course, you're up in the Arctic. It's basically like it was during the last ice age. So scientists and archaeologists have divided North America into what they call different culture regions, depending on what the culture was like for the Native Americans who lived there. And of course, the Native Americans' culture depended entirely on the environment and the resources that they had to survive. Some of these culture areas were the Northeast, the Southwest, the Great Plains, and we're going to be reading about all three of those culture areas. And the culture area that I mentioned earlier with the Inuits and the Igloos, that would be the Arctic. So Native Americans had to adapt to many different types of environments after the last ice age. And your next reading is going to look at two of those environments, the desert Southwest and the Great Plains. And as you're working on these readings, I want you to be looking for examples of how these Native American groups used natural resources to meet their basic needs of food, shelter, and clothing.